There are some secrets so carefully guarded that entire communities bind themselves to silence, not through spoken agreement, but through a collective understanding that certain truths, once acknowledged, would unravel the very fabric of society itself. Charleston, South Carolina, in the late 1840s, was a city built on such secrets. Behind the elegant facades of townhouses, with their wrought iron balconies and the sprawling fields of rice plantations that stretched toward the horizon, an uncomfortable pattern had begun emerging, one that everyone seemed determined not to notice. Dr. William Hutchins first observed it during a routine medical examination in the spring of 1847. He was a physician of modest reputation, recently arrived from Boston to establish his practice in the South. His northerner status already made him an outsider, but his keen eye for detail would soon make him something far more dangerous, a witness to what an entire society had agreed to overlook. The child he examined that day was named Jacob, a 7-year-old boy brought to his office by an overseer from the Fairmont plantation. The boy had injured his arm in a fall from a wagon, nothing serious, but as Dr. Hutchins set the bone and wrapped it carefully, he found himself staring at the child's face with growing unease. The resemblance was unmistakable. Jacob had the same narrow nose, the same distinctive cleft chin, the same unusual gray-green eyes as Colonel Thomas Fairmont himself, a man Dr. Hutchins had dined with just 2 weeks prior at a social gathering. But it was more than just individual features. The entire cast of the boy's face, the way he held his head, even the shape of his hands as Dr. Hutchins examined them, all bore an uncanny similarity to the colonel. Dr. Hutchins said nothing. He finished treating the boy, gave the overseer instructions for care, and sent them on their way. But the observation lodged itself in his mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. Over the following months, he began to notice the pattern everywhere. The mulatto children who worked in the kitchens, who tended the gardens, who ran errands through Charleston's cobblestone streets, many of them bore striking resemblances to the city's most prominent families. There was a girl named Mary who worked at the Weston household, possessing the same distinctive auburn hair and freckled complexion as Mrs. Adelaide Weston's own daughters, though Mary's skin was several shades darker. A young boy named Samuel at the Reynolds estate, who had the exact same prominent forehead and wide-set eyes as Judge Marcus Reynolds, replicated so precisely it was almost eerie. A teenage girl called Hannah at the Pritchard plantation, who had the same aquiline nose and high cheekbones as Edmund Pritchard, one of Charleston's wealthiest merchants. Everywhere Dr. Hutchins looked, he saw these living mirrors, these unacknowledged connections written plainly on human faces. What disturbed him most was not the resemblances themselves, the implications of those were obvious enough, but the absolute silence that surrounded them. No one mentioned it, no one acknowledged it. Servants who must have known the truth never spoke of it. Masters who saw these living reminders of their own features every day acted as if they noticed nothing unusual. It was as if an entire population had collectively agreed to look away from what was plainly visible before their eyes. Dr. Hutchins was not a crusader by nature. He had come south for professional opportunity, not moral confrontation. At 33 years old, he was ambitious but cautious, a scientist more than an activist. He had seen the success of the cotton economy, the wealth that flowed through Charleston's ports, and he wanted to establish himself in this prosperous society. But his medical training had instilled in him a respect for observable truth, and this conspiracy of blindness troubled him deeply. He began keeping notes, not out of any particular plan, but simply because documentation was his habit. In his private journal, he recorded what he saw, dates, names, descriptions of resemblances. He told himself it was mere scientific curiosity, a physician's natural tendency to observe and record patterns in the human form. His opportunity to discuss the matter came unexpectedly at a dinner party hosted by the Beauregards in late June. The evening was warm, the air thick with humidity and the scent of jasmine from the garden. The company was genteel, conversation flowing as smoothly as the wine. Among the guests was Reverend Jonathan Sawyer, an elderly minister who had served Charleston's churches for over 40 years. After dinner, as the ladies retired to the drawing room and the men lingered over brandy and cigars, Dr. Hutchins found himself alone with the Reverend on the veranda, watching fireflies dance in the garden below. "Reverend Sawyer," Dr. Hutchins began carefully, swirling the brandy in his glass. "I've noticed something during my practice here, something that puzzles me." The old minister's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened slightly on his glass. His eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, fixed on Dr. Hutchins with sudden attention. "Oh, the children," Dr. Hutchins continued, choosing his words with care. "The enslaved children, many of them bear remarkable resemblances to Dr. Hutchins." The Reverend's voice was gentle but firm, with an undertone that suggested this was not the first time he had had such a conversation. "You are new to our city. There are many things here that may seem unusual to northern eyes. With respect, Reverend, this has nothing to do with regional differences. It's a matter of observable fact. These children share physical characteristics of things that are better left unexamined." Reverend Sawyer turned to face him fully, setting his glass down on the balustrade with deliberate care. "You seem like a decent man, Doctor, intelligent, well-educated. Let me offer you some advice. Charleston is a city of considerable complexity. Its stability depends on certain understandings, unspoken agreements that maintain social order. You're asking me to ignore what I can plainly see? I'm asking you to understand that what you see and what you speak of are two different matters entirely. Many men have seen what you've seen, Doctor. Every physician in this city has made the same observations you have. The question is not whether one sees such things, but whether one has the wisdom to recognize that some observations serve no useful purpose when spoken aloud." The Reverend paused, taking a slow sip of his brandy before continuing. "Let me ask you something. What do you imagine would happen if these resemblances were publicly acknowledged? If we were to stand up in church and declare the parentage of every child in this city?" Dr. Hutchins had no answer. "I'll tell you what would happen," Reverend Sawyer continued, his voice taking on a professorial tone. "Families would be destroyed. Marriages would dissolve. Inheritance disputes would tear apart estates. Children, both the acknowledged and unacknowledged, would suffer consequences they did nothing to deserve. And for what purpose? To satisfy some abstract principle of truth? Truth is not abstract, Reverend. It's fundamental." "Is it?" The old man's eyes were sad. "I've been a minister for 43 years, Doctor. I've baptized hundreds of children in this city. I've married couples, buried the dead, counseled the troubled. And I've learned that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, silence is the most compassionate choice." The Reverend's tone was kind, almost paternal, which somehow made his words more chilling. He was not threatening Dr. Hutchins, but nor was he being entirely gentle. He was simply stating a fact about how this society operated, delivered with the certainty of long experience. "Consider the children themselves," Reverend Sawyer went on. "Many of the ones you've noticed receive certain advantages, do they not? Better clothing, lighter duties, sometimes instruction in reading or a trade. These small mercies exist precisely because of the silence. If we were to speak openly, those advantages would vanish. The resemblances would become public scandals rather than private arrangements. The children would lose what little they have." Dr. Hutchins wanted to argue, but the logic was difficult to counter. He had indeed noticed that many of the children with obvious resemblances seemed to occupy slightly better positions than other enslaved children. It was as if their masters, unable to acknowledge them openly, tried to provide for them through these subtle means. "I can see you're thinking about what I've said," the Reverend noted with approval. "That's good. That suggests wisdom." He placed a hand on Dr. Hutchins' shoulder, a gesture that felt both supportive and warning. "Charleston welcomes you, Doctor. Your medical skills are needed here. But every community has its customs, its ways of managing difficult truths. Give yourself time to understand ours before you decide to challenge them." Dr. Hutchins changed the subject, and the evening continued pleasantly enough. But as he walked home through Charleston's humid streets that night, past houses where candles flickered in windows and enslaved people moved silently through shadows, he felt as if he had been initiated into some vast, unspoken conspiracy. The following week brought an invitation that Dr. Hutchins initially interpreted as a social courtesy. Mrs. Constance Hartwell, a widow of considerable social standing, requested his presence for tea. He had treated her for minor ailments on 2 occasions, arthritis in her hands and a persistent cough, and he assumed this was simply a thank-you gesture from a patient. He was wrong. Mrs. Hartwell received him in her drawing room, a space decorated with impeccable taste. European furniture, paintings by respected artists, silver tea service that gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. A young enslaved girl, perhaps 14, served the tea with practiced efficiency before being dismissed. After the customary pleasantries about the weather and Charleston society, Mrs. Hartwell set down her teacup and came to the point with surprising directness. "Dr. Hutchins, I understand you've been making certain observations about Charleston's families." He felt his stomach tighten. The tea suddenly seemed too hot, the room too close. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Hartwell. Please don't insult my intelligence, Doctor. This is a small community, and word travels quickly among those who matter. You've been noticed asking questions, making comparisons, discussing sensitive matters with Reverend Sawyer. Your interest in certain patterns has not gone unremarked." Dr. Hutchins set his cup down carefully, buying time to think. "I've done nothing improper, madam. I'm a physician. I observe human beings. It's the foundation of my profession. Haven't you?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a specimen. "You've been examining something that this community has collectively chosen not to examine. That is, in its way, quite improper indeed. It violates an understanding that everyone else has managed to grasp. With respect, Mrs. Hartwell, I'm a scientist. I observe, I record, I document. These are not crimes, aren't they?" Her voice remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Let me be frank with you, Doctor, because I believe you're intelligent enough to understand. What possible good do you imagine could come from giving voice to your observations? What do you hope to achieve?" It was a fair question. One Dr. Hutchins had been asking himself increasingly. What was his purpose in noting these resemblances? What did he hope to accomplish with his journal full of documented cases? "I believe in truth," he said finally. "I believe that facts matter." Mrs. Hartwell's laugh was brittle, like ice cracking. "Truth. What a luxury, Doctor. What an expensive, destructive luxury. Let me tell you what truth would mean in this case. It would mean public acknowledgement of private matters. It would mean the destruction of families, the complication of inheritances, the upending of social structures that provide order to thousands of lives, both free and enslaved." "And the children themselves, Doctor?" Hutchins leaned forward, feeling his temper rise despite his efforts to remain calm. "Don't they deserve truth? Don't they deserve to know who they are? Do they?" Mrs. Hartwell's eyes were hard now. "Tell me, Doctor, what would that knowledge give them? The ability to claim their fathers, legal recognition, inheritance rights? No. It would give them nothing but the confirmation of circumstances they cannot change. At best, it would satisfy their curiosity. At worst, it would burden them with painful knowledge that serves no practical purpose." She paused, pouring more tea with hands that remained perfectly steady. "The children you've noticed are cared for, are they not? They are fed, clothed, housed. Many are taught trades, given opportunities they would not have otherwise. Some are even given their freedom eventually, though always quietly, always through supposedly unrelated circumstances. What would your truth add to their lives except complication?" Dr. Hutchins had no immediate answer. It was true that many of these children received certain advantages. He had noted it himself. Jacob, the boy with Colonel Fairmont's features, was learning carpentry, a skilled trade. Mary, the girl with auburn hair, worked inside the Weston house rather than in the fields, a vastly preferable situation. Samuel was being trained as a body servant, a position that offered relative comfort and status. "I can see you're thinking, Doctor. That's good." Mrs. Hartwell's voice softened slightly. "Let me tell you a story. 20 years ago, there was a young lawyer from Virginia, name of Harrison Welch. Brilliant man, full of ideals he'd absorbed in university. He came to Charleston and began making noise about exactly what you've been observing. He was going to expose the truth, he said. He planned to write about it, to publish his findings in a newspaper up north. What happened to him? Nothing dramatic, if that's what you're imagining. No violence, no threats, nothing so crude." Mrs. Hartwell smiled faintly. His practice simply failed. No one hired him. No cases came his way. Invitations stopped arriving. He found himself unable to rent decent lodgings. Landlords always had some excuse about prior commitments. His credit with merchants dried up. Within 6 months, he had left Charleston, professionally ruined and financially broken. Last I heard, he was working as a clerk in Richmond. All his promise wasted, all his brilliance dimmed to nothing. The threat, though unspoken, hung in the air between them as clearly as if she had shouted it. "I'm telling you this, Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice returning to its earlier pleasant tone. "Not to frighten you, but to help you understand how things work here. Charleston is not cruel, Dr. Hutchins, but it is unified. When an entire community agrees on something, even in silence, even without explicit coordination, that agreement has tremendous force. It's like a current in the ocean. You can't see it, but it's powerful enough to drown anyone who swims against it." She stood, signaling that the interview was over. "You're a skilled physician, Doctor. Charleston needs your services. You could have a prosperous, respected life here. Or you could choose a different path and find yourself swimming against that current." She extended her hand. "I trust you'll make the wise choice." After he left Mrs. Hartwell's elegant home, Dr. Hutchins walked for hours through the city. The afternoon had turned to evening, gaslights beginning to flicker to life on street corners. He walked past the market, where vendors were packing up their wares, past churches with their white steeples reaching toward darkening sky, past homes where families gathered for dinner, their voices and laughter drifting through open windows. He loved Charleston, he realized with a pang. He loved the graceful architecture, the intellectual society he had begun to enter, the sense of history that permeated every street. His practice was growing. He had been invited to join a prestigious medical society. His future here had seemed bright, but could he live with the silence? That night, seated at his desk in the small house he rented on Church Street, he took out his journal and stared at the pages of observations he had compiled over the past months. Names, descriptions, documented resemblances, case after case meticulously recorded. Jacob, age 7, enslaved at Fairmont Plantation. Resemblance to Colonel Thomas Fairmont. Gray-green eyes, rare, cleft chin, narrow nose, similar ear shape and placement. Mother, Rachel, kitchen worker, age 28. Mary, age 10, enslaved at Weston household. Resemblance to Adelaide Weston. Auburn hair, very unusual in enslaved population. Freckled complexion, green eyes, similar facial structure. Mother, Sarah, laundress, age 32. Samuel, age 8, enslaved at Reynolds estate. Resemblance to Judge Marcus Reynolds, prominent forehead, wide-set eyes, distinctive jawline, similar height for age. Mother, Dinah seamstress, age 35. The list went on. Page after page, each entry a documented case of resemblance so striking it couldn't be coincidental. Each entry representing a truth that everyone saw but no one acknowledged. What was it all for? What did he hope to achieve? He thought of Jacob with his injured arm, stoic and silent as Dr. Hutchins set the bone. He thought of Mary serving tea in the Weston household, moving with practiced grace under Adelaide Weston's supervision. He thought of Samuel, whom he'd glimpsed once running an errand for Judge Reynolds, the resemblance so marked that passers-by would glance twice before looking quickly away. These children were living proof of truths no one would speak. But what good would speaking those truths accomplish? Dr. Hutchins made a decision that night. He would continue his observations, but he would keep them private. He would not speak of them publicly, would not write articles or make accusations or force confrontation, but nor would he destroy his notes. He would bear witness, even if silently, even if only for himself. It was a compromise, and it satisfied no one, least of all himself. The summer passed in a haze of heat and humidity. Dr. Hutchins settled into his practice and Charleston's social life. He learned to avert his eyes, to not see what everyone else had learned not to see. He became complicit in the conspiracy of silence, though the knowledge sat uneasily in his chest. He treated patients without commenting on family resemblances. He attended dinner parties without raising uncomfortable questions. He smiled and nodded, and became one more participant in Charleston's elaborate dance of denial. But he continued to write in his journal. Every case of resemblance he encountered, he documented. It became a compulsion, a way of maintaining his sense of truth, even as he participated in the collective lie. Then came September, and the case that would change everything. Senator Bradford Marchmont was one of Charleston's most powerful figures. His plantation, Riverside, encompassed over 3,000 acres of prime, rice-growing land. His political influence reached all the way to Washington, where he had served 2 terms before returning to South Carolina to manage his business interests. At 52, he was wealthy, respected, and utterly untouchable. His wife, Caroline Marchmont, was a beauty from an old Virginia family. At 38, she had given Senator Marchmont 4 healthy children, 3 sons and a daughter, all impeccably proper, all destined for positions of prominence in Charleston society. In September of 1847, Caroline Marchmont gave birth to their 5th child, a daughter they named Eleanor. Dr. Hutchins was not the attending physician. Senator Marchmont employed Dr. Theodore Ashworth, Charleston's most expensive and respected doctor, for his family, but he heard about the birth through the usual social channels: birth announcements, congratulations at gatherings, the normal circulation of news through Charleston's interconnected society. But within days, Dr. Hutchins began hearing other things: whispers, rumors, fragments of conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Something was wrong with the Marchmont baby. The whispers were quiet, but persistent. The baby, Eleanor, had been born with dark skin. Not the pale complexion of her parents and siblings, but noticeably, unmistakably darker. Darker, in fact, than many of the enslaved children at Riverside Plantation. At first, Dr. Hutchins dismissed it as exaggeration. Babies were sometimes born with darker complexions that lightened over time. It wasn't uncommon, but the whispers continued, and they carried a note of genuine scandal that suggested something more significant. It was impossible, of course. Both Senator Marchmont and his wife Caroline were of pure European descent, families that traced their lineage back to English nobility. Senator Marchmont's family had been in South Carolina since 1690. Caroline's Virginia ancestors had arrived even earlier. There was no explanation for a dark-skinned child. Except, of course, there was. The explanation that no one would speak aloud was this: Caroline Marchmont had not been faithful to her husband, and the father of her child was almost certainly one of the enslaved men at Riverside. It was a scandal of unimaginable proportions. If true, it represented not just adultery, but the ultimate violation of Charleston's racial codes. A white woman of the highest social class bearing the child of an enslaved man. It was the nightmare scenario that kept Charleston's power structure awake at night. But the scandal was handled in the most peculiar way. A birth announcement appeared in the Charleston Mercury, congratulating Senator and Mrs. Marchmont on the arrival of their daughter, Eleanor. The notice was brief, formal, exactly like dozens of others that appeared in the newspaper. But the child herself was never seen in public. No christening was held at St. Michael's Church, where the Marchmont family had worshipped for generations. No visitors were received to admire the baby, as was customary for families of their stature. The Marchmont house, usually a center of social activity, closed its doors. Dr. Hutchins, curious despite himself, made discreet inquiries. What he learned was fragmentary and troubling. Dr. Ashworth, the attending physician, had reportedly left town immediately after the birth, taking a sudden trip to New Orleans that had been unplanned. His wife told people he had urgent business, but the timing seemed suspicious. The midwife who had assisted at the birth, an enslaved woman named Patience, had been sold within a week to a plantation in Georgia. This was unusual. Patience was considered one of the best midwives in Charleston, valued for her skill and experience. 2 of the Marchmont household servants, both women who had been present during the birth, had also been sold, also to distant locations. Within a month, word spread quietly through Charleston that little Eleanor Marchmont had died of fever. A small funeral was held, attended only by immediate family. No body was displayed, which was explained by the fever having been particularly severe. The burial took place at the private cemetery at Riverside Plantation, not in Charleston proper. Society expressed appropriate sympathy. Condolence cards were sent. Senator Marchmont received colleagues at his home, accepting their sorrowful words with grave dignity. Caroline Marchmont remained in seclusion, understandably devastated by the loss of her infant daughter. Life continued. The scandal that might have been never materialized because the truth was never acknowledged. But Dr. Hutchins, through his connections in the medical community and his own careful investigation, learned something different. There had been no fever. The child, Eleanor, had not died. She was alive. The information came to him through Dr. Marcus Fleming, a younger colleague who had recently begun practicing in Charleston. They had become friendly, drawn together by their outsider status. Fleming was from Philadelphia, as foreign to Charleston as Dr. Hutchins himself. Over drinks one evening, Fleming mentioned something odd. He had been called to Riverside Plantation to treat an overseer for a broken leg. While there, he had glimpsed a very young infant being cared for by one of the enslaved families, a couple in their 30s who already had several children of their own. "The thing is," Fleming said, lowering his voice though they were alone, "the baby was clearly newborn, couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and it looked nothing like the couple supposedly raising it. The mother and father were both quite dark-skinned, but this baby was lighter, still darker than white, but mixed. Mulatto, clearly. That's not so unusual," Dr. Hutchins said carefully. "Skin tone varies. I know, but that's not what struck me. It was the way the overseer reacted when he saw me notice the baby. He practically pushed me out of the cabin. Got very aggressive about it, said I had no business looking at the slaves' children. It seemed excessive." Dr. Hutchins felt his pulse quicken. "When was this?" "About 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks after Eleanor Marchmont had supposedly died of fever." Dr. Hutchins began investigating more carefully. He spoke to an enslaved man named Daniel who sometimes assisted him with deliveries, carrying his medical bag and helping transport patients. Daniel worked odd jobs around Charleston and heard things, saw things. "Daniel," Dr. Hutchins said one afternoon as they walked back from a house call, "do you know the family at Riverside, the ones who recently took in a new baby?" Daniel's face went carefully blank. "I don't know nothing about that, doctor. I'm not looking to cause trouble. I'm just trying to understand what happened. Understanding some things just brings trouble, sir. That's what folks say." But later, as Dr. Hutchins paid him for his help, Daniel spoke quietly. "That baby didn't come from where they say it came from, that's all I can tell you. And if you're smart, doctor, you won't go asking more questions. People who ask questions about that particular situation tend to find themselves in difficulty." It was enough confirmation. Eleanor Marchmont was alive, hidden in plain sight on her father's plantation, raised as the child of enslaved parents. Her true parentage would remain forever unacknowledged, her existence as a Marchmont erased from all official records. Senator Marchmont's daughter would grow up as property on his own plantation, owned by her father in the most literal sense possible. The magnitude of the deception staggered Dr. Hutchins. This was not merely a matter of unacknowledged resemblances or quiet denials. This was active, coordinated suppression of truth involving dozens of people. The physician had been sent away or silenced. The midwife and witnesses had been sold and scattered. A false death had been announced and mourned. Records had been falsified, all to maintain the fiction that nothing unusual had occurred. Dr. Hutchins felt sick. This went beyond individual cases of resemblance. This was systematic erasure of identity, supported by the full weight of Charleston's power structure. He began investigating more deeply. How common were cases like Eleanor's? How many other children had been disappeared into the enslaved population? Their true parentage is known but never acknowledged. What he discovered over the following weeks was that Eleanor Marchmont's case, while extreme, was not unique. There had been others over the years. Children born to prominent white families who did not fit the expected appearance. Children who simply vanished from official records. Some were said to have died in infancy, buried quickly with little ceremony. Others were sent away to distant relatives, never to be mentioned again. Still others, like Eleanor, were hidden within the enslaved population of their own family's plantations. The most disturbing case Dr. Hutchins uncovered involved the Grantham family going back 15 years. Elizabeth Grantham, wife of plantation owner Robert Grantham, had given birth to a son in 1832. The boy, named William, had been born with features that suggested mixed ancestry. The official story was that William had been stillborn. A funeral had been held, a grave marker placed in the family cemetery. But Dr. Hutchins found a different truth through careful research and quiet conversations. William Grantham had not died. He had been given to a wet nurse, an enslaved woman whose own infant had recently died, and raised as her child. He was now 15 years old, working in the stables at the Grantham plantation, his true identity known to some but acknowledged by none. The boy had grown up literally owned by his own father, never knowing his true parentage, treated as property rather than family. There were other cases. A daughter born to the Preston family in 1839, supposedly sent to live with cousins in Georgia, but actually given to enslaved caregivers. A son born to the Whitefield family in 1845, said to have died of complications, but actually raised by an enslaved couple on a distant property. The pattern was clear and horrifying. When the conspiracy of silence around mixed-race children broke down, when the evidence was too obvious to ignore, Charleston's society had a solution. They simply made the children disappear into the enslaved population, using the very system of ownership to hide the evidence of its own violations. Dr. Hutchins realized he was documenting not just individual cases of resemblance, but an entire system of suppression and denial. Charleston had developed elaborate mechanisms, both social and legal, to maintain silence around uncomfortable truths. The medical establishment was complicit, recording false causes of death. The legal system was complicit, processing false documents without question. The church was complicit, performing funerals for children who hadn't died. The newspapers were complicit, printing announcements they knew to be false. Everyone participated. Everyone knew. No one spoke. Dr. Hutchins decided he had to act. Not publicly, he had learned that lesson too well, but somehow. He would compile his evidence, create a comprehensive record, and find a way to ensure it survived, even if he could not speak it aloud in his lifetime. He worked through the autumn of 1847 with growing urgency. His journal expanded beyond simple observations of resemblance to detailed documentation of the conspiracy itself. He recorded names, dates, circumstances. He interviewed people carefully, always cautiously building a case. He spoke with enslaved people who would talk to him, though most were understandably reluctant. Those who did speak told him stories that broke his heart. Mothers who had raised children they knew weren't their own, carrying the secret of the child's true parentage. Children who had grown up confused by their appearance, knowing they looked different but never understanding why. Families torn apart when inconvenient children were sold away to maintain the fiction. One woman, An elderly cook named Martha, who had worked in Charleston households for 60 years, told him about the old days. "It's always been this way," she said, her voice tired. "Always these children who look like their masters. Always the silence about it. But it used to be people would at least whisper about it among themselves. Now it's like everyone's agreed to not even whisper. Like if we all just refuse to see it, it stops being true." "How many children?" Dr. Hutchins asked. "In all your years, how many have you seen who are obviously—" "Too many to count, Doctor. Too many. And the sad thing is, most of them never know. They grow up thinking they're just who they appear to be. Maybe that's a mercy, maybe not. I can't decide." Dr. Hutchins also managed to interview a retired physician, Dr. Albert Morrison, who was dying of consumption and had grown philosophical about his career. "I've delivered maybe 1,000 babies in my time," Morrison told him, his voice weak and raspy. "And I can tell you, Hutchins, that at least 50 of them were babies who didn't look like they should have. Mixed ancestry where both parents were supposed to be white. Dark skin where there should have been light. Features that didn't match. What did you do in those cases? What could I do? I delivered the baby, accepted my fee, and kept my mouth shut. Sometimes the family would ask me to record the death of an infant that hadn't died. Sometimes they'd ask me to falsify records, change dates, create documentation for explanations that didn't hold up to scrutiny. I did what I was asked because that's what every doctor in Charleston does. You refuse, you don't work. Didn't it trouble you?" Morrison coughed, a deep, painful sound. "Of course it troubled me. I'm dying now, Hutchins, and I can tell you it troubles me still. I've carried the weight of those silences for 40 years, but what choice did I have? You tell me, what choice did any of us have?" It was the question Dr. Hutchins couldn't answer. Individual moral courage seemed powerless against such a massive, coordinated system of denial. In November, things escalated further. Dr. Hutchins arrived at his office one morning to find it had been vandalized. The damage was not extensive. Nothing was stolen, no equipment was broken, but papers were strewn about, drawers pulled open, clearly searched. Someone had been looking for something specific. His journal, which he kept hidden in a locked box beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom at home, remained safe. But the message was clear. He was being watched, and people were concerned about what he might have documented. The following day, he received a visit from Judge Marcus Reynolds himself, the same man whose features Dr. Hutchins had noted in the enslaved boy, Samuel. Reynolds was a formidable figure, tall and imposing, with a voice accustomed to authority. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Dr. Hutchins, I'll be direct. You've been making inquiries that concern members of this community. Important members. People are troubled by your interest in matters that are best left alone. I'm a physician, Judge Reynolds. I observe. You're a visitor to Charleston, Doctor, a guest in our city, and guests who abuse the hospitality extended to them often find that hospitality withdrawn." It was the closest anyone had come to an open threat. Dr. Hutchins felt anger rise in his chest. "Are you threatening me, Judge? I'm informing you of consequences. There are things in Charleston that work a certain way, systems that have been in place for generations. These systems serve important purposes, maintain social stability, protect the interests of many people. When someone threatens those systems, the community responds. Not through violence or criminality, but through the natural consequences of social disapproval." Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Your practice is declining, is it not? Patients are finding other physicians. Invitations are becoming scarce. This will continue and accelerate if you persist in your current course. Within 6 months, you'll find Charleston an impossible place to practice medicine. Within a year, you'll be forced to leave, professionally ruined and financially broken. And if I stop asking questions, if you demonstrate wisdom and discretion, if you show that you understand how things work here, then your practice will recover. You'll find yourself welcomed back into society. Opportunities will present themselves. Charleston can be very generous to those who respect its customs." After Reynolds left, Dr. Hutchins sat in his office for a long time, his hands shaking with suppressed rage and fear. The threat had been delivered with absolute confidence, because Reynolds knew he could make good on it. He had the power, the connections, the resources, and he had the implicit support of Charleston's entire power structure. Dr. Hutchins was one man against a system. How could he possibly win? That night, he reviewed his journal. Months of observations, interviews, documentation. A comprehensive record of Charleston's conspiracy of silence, its elaborate mechanisms for suppressing truth and maintaining fiction. What was it for? What could he possibly do with it? He couldn't publish it in Charleston. No newspaper would touch it, and he'd be destroyed before the ink dried. He couldn't send it north without risking interception. His correspondence was probably being monitored. He couldn't use it to challenge the system legally. The courts were run by the same men who benefited from the silence. The truth he had documented seemed powerless against the weight of coordinated denial. A week later, his practice suffered another blow. 3 more regular patients informed him they would be seeking care elsewhere. One of them, a merchant named Joseph Cartwright, at least had the decency to be apologetic about it. "I'm sorry, Dr. Hutchins. You're a fine physician, but my wife has been receiving pressure, social pressure. Women she thought were friends are suddenly distant. Invitations that used to come regularly have stopped. It's been made clear that our association with you is causing problems. I've done nothing wrong. Haven't you?" Cartwright's expression was pained. "You've challenged things that everyone else has agreed not to challenge. That's seen as worse than doing something actively wrong. At least wrongdoing is comprehensible, but this, you're threatening the foundations everyone stands on." By December, Dr. Hutchins's income had dropped by nearly half. He was forced to let go the young man who had been helping him with administrative tasks. He cut back on personal expenses, stopped attending social events that required financial contribution, began living more modestly. He was being slowly strangled, professionally and socially, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The invisible hand of Charleston's disapproval was closing around him, methodical and patient. The solution, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. One of his few remaining patients was Miss Abigail Thornton, an elderly woman who had married a Charleston merchant 40 years earlier and been widowed young. She was a New Englander by birth, originally from Massachusetts, and she had never fully integrated into Charleston society. This independence, combined with her considerable inherited wealth, gave her a freedom most women in Charleston didn't possess. During a house call to treat her persistent rheumatism, she brought up his situation with characteristic directness. "Dr. Hutchins, I understand you've been causing quite a stir among Charleston's finest families." He smiled ruefully as he examined her swollen joints. "I wasn't aware I was doing anything particularly stirring, Miss Thornton." "Don't be coy, Doctor. Everyone knows what you've been observing and recording. The question on everyone's mind is what you intend to do about it. Some are betting you'll leave Charleston within the month. Others think you'll stay, but give up your investigation. A few think you'll do something foolish that will force more direct action against you. And what do you think?" She studied him with sharp eyes that missed nothing despite her 72 years. "I think you're a man struggling with his conscience. I recognize the look because I wore it myself once." "What do you mean?" "Sit down, Doctor. Your examination can wait a moment." She gestured to a chair. "When I first came to Charleston 40 years ago as a young bride, I was shocked by what I saw. The resemblances between enslaved children and their supposed masters. The unspoken realities hanging in the air like humidity. I was young and idealistic, fresh from Boston where people at least pretended to care about moral consistency. I thought it was my duty to speak up. What happened? I was educated," she said dryly, "by people much like those who have been visiting you recently. They explained to me in terms both gentle and firm that my observations, however accurate, would serve no useful purpose. That speaking them aloud would cause harm without producing benefit. That I was threatening the stability of a social system that, for all its flaws, maintained order and prosperity. And you accepted that?" "I did." I was young, newly married, financially dependent on my husband and his Charleston connections. I didn't have the strength or resources to stand alone against an entire society. She paused, her expression distant with memory. But I've regretted it ever since. For 40 years, Dr. Hutchins, I've lived with silence. I've watched children grow up not knowing who they really are. I've seen families built on lies, inheritances distributed according to fictions, entire lives shaped by denials. And I've said nothing. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that whatever you decide, there will be consequences. If you speak out, you'll face professional ruin and social exile. If you remain silent, you'll face the slow erosion of your own conscience, the gradual hollowing out of your sense of self. Neither choice is easy. Both will cost you something essential. Dr. Hutchins absorbed this in silence. It was the most honest counsel anyone had given him. "What would you do in my position?" he asked finally. Miss Thornton was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled fingers folding and unfolding in her lap. "I can't answer that because I don't know what I would have done if I'd been stronger. But I can tell you this, if you have evidence, if you've compiled documentation, you should preserve it. Not necessarily publish it now, that would destroy you without changing anything. But preserve it, for history, for the future, so that someday, when circumstances change, someone will know the truth." It was the wisest counsel Dr. Hutchins had received. That night he began planning how to follow it. He spent the next month creating multiple copies of his journal, carefully transcribed by his own hand. Each copy ran to over 200 pages, densely written with observations, interviews, documented cases. He recorded not just the resemblances themselves, but the entire system that maintained silence around them. Names, dates, specific incidents. The physicians who falsified records. The lawyers who processed fraudulent documents. The ministers who performed funerals for children who hadn't died. The entire conspiracy, documented in detail. He sealed each copy in oilcloth to protect against moisture and decay, then wrapped them in sturdy canvas. Each package was addressed to a different recipient with instructions written in a letter enclosed inside. One copy went to Miss Thornton, who agreed to keep it sealed until his death or until he requested its return. She would place it in her bank vault, where it would be safe from search or seizure. Another he sent to his brother Edward in Boston, a lawyer who would understand its significance. His letter explained the contents and asked Edward to keep it safe, to pass it to his children with instructions to preserve it. A third copy he buried in a sealed metal container on a small property he owned outside Charleston, a plot of land he'd purchased as investment that included a small cabin. He marked the location carefully in a separate document that he entrusted to Miss Thornton, along with her copy. Other copies went to professional colleagues in other cities, a doctor in Philadelphia, a lawyer in Baltimore, a minister in Richmond. Each agreed to serve as custodian without fully knowing the contents. His letters explained only that the packages contained medical observations of historical importance that should be preserved unopened for at least 20 years. The final copy he kept himself, hidden beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. It was his compromise with conscience. He would not publish, would not create immediate chaos or martyr himself to no purpose. But nor would he let the truth disappear entirely. Someday, perhaps long after everyone involved was dead, his documentation would surface. History would know what Charleston had chosen to forget. By March of 1848, Dr. Hutchins had completed his distribution and made his peace with silence. His practice, having stabilized at a modest level, began to slowly recover. Word had apparently spread that he had ceased his investigations. Patients began returning, cautiously at first, then more regularly. He was never again invited to the finest social events, but he wasn't completely ostracized either. He had been categorized as eccentric but harmless, which was exactly where he needed to be to survive in Charleston. He continued his medical work, treating patients of all classes and colors without comment on their resemblances or relationships. He learned to see without seeing, to know without acknowledging. He became one more participant in Charleston's conspiracy of silence. But every night, he thought about those sealed packages scattered across the country. His testimony, waiting. His truth, preserved. It was a small victory, perhaps meaningless in practical terms, but it was something. The years passed slowly. Dr. Hutchins remained in Charleston, becoming a familiar if marginal figure in the medical community. He never married, never achieved great prominence, never again challenged the social order he had once tried to expose. But he continued to observe. His original journal, the one he kept hidden, continued to grow. Every case of resemblance he encountered, every child born with features that told uncomfortable truths, every instance of the conspiracy of silence, he documented them all. Jacob grew into a young man, still bearing Colonel Fairmont's unmistakable features, now working as a skilled carpenter. Dr. Hutchins treated him once for a hand injury sustained while working and saw that the resemblance had only grown more pronounced with age. Jacob was polite, respectful, and gave no indication that he knew or cared whose eyes looked back at him from the mirror. Mary, the girl with auburn hair, became a woman still working in the Weston household kitchens. Dr. Hutchins saw her occasionally when making calls to treat the Weston family. She had developed into a beauty, her resemblance to Adelaide Weston now impossible to miss. But no one mentioned it. Adelaide Weston supervised Mary's work with the same cool authority she used with all the household staff, never acknowledging the living mirror in her kitchen. Samuel, the boy with Judge Reynolds' distinctive features, was trained as a body servant and eventually given relative freedom of movement around Charleston. Dr. Hutchins would see him sometimes, running errands for the Reynolds household, his face a younger version of the judge's, visible to anyone who cared to look. And no one looked. The conspiracy of silence held. Dr. Hutchins learned what happened to Eleanor Marchmont, the baby who had supposedly died of fever. Through careful inquiries over the years, he discovered that she was indeed alive, raised by an enslaved couple at Riverside Plantation. She went by the name Ellie and was being trained as a seamstress. Senator Marchmont never acknowledged her, never spoke to her directly, but he had given quiet instructions that she was to be treated well, taught a trade, and eventually freed when she turned 25. It was the best he could offer his daughter, while maintaining the fiction of her non-existence. In 1852, Caroline Marchmont died of pneumonia. Her funeral was lavish, attended by Charleston's elite. Senator Marchmont mourned publicly and appropriately. During the reception after the burial, Dr. Hutchins, present in his capacity as a physician who had treated Mrs. Marchmont, observed a young woman serving refreshments to guests. She was about 5 years old, with features that suggested mixed ancestry, working with careful precision under the supervision of older household staff. It was Ellie, Eleanor Marchmont, serving at her own mother's funeral, unacknowledged and invisible. Dr. Hutchins felt his heart break a little more that day. The years continued to accumulate. Charleston changed and didn't change. The rice economy flourished. New fortunes were made. Families rose and fell in the social hierarchy. Political tensions grew as debates over slavery intensified nationally. But the conspiracy of silence around the children held firm. New generations learned the same unspoken rules. Young people coming of age in Charleston absorbed the understanding that some truths were not to be spoken, that some observations were better left unvoiced. Dr. Hutchins, now in his 40s, had become a fixture of Charleston's medical landscape. His past investigations were largely forgotten, remembered only as a brief oddity from his early days in the city. He was regarded as competent if somewhat melancholy, a bachelor physician who kept to himself. In 1857, he received news that his brother Edward had died in Boston. Among Edward's effects was the sealed package Dr. Hutchins had sent him 9 years earlier, now returned per his instructions. Dr. Hutchins received it and placed it with his own hidden journal, which had grown to over 500 pages. Miss Abigail Thornton died in 1859 at the age of 84. In her will, she left specific instructions about the package Dr. Hutchins had entrusted to her. It was to be held by her lawyer for 20 years after her death, then delivered to Dr. Hutchins if he still lived, or to his heirs if he did not. The country was sliding toward war. Political tensions that had been building for decades finally reached breaking point. In December 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Charleston celebrated with parades and speeches, fireworks and jubilation. Dr. Hutchins watched it all with a heavy heart, knowing what was coming. The war, when it came in 1861, consumed Charleston as it consumed the entire South. Dr. Hutchins, too old for military service at 47, served as a civilian physician, treating wounded soldiers in hospitals overwhelmed with casualties. The children he had documented years earlier were now adults. Jacob, Colonel Fairmont's son, had been conscripted into Confederate service despite his enslaved status. Mary still worked in the Weston household, which had lost 2 sons to the war. Samuel served Judge Reynolds, who had become increasingly frail. The war changed everything and nothing. Even amid the chaos and death, the conspiracy of silence held. The resemblances remained unacknowledged, the truths unspoken. Charleston fell to Union forces in 1865. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery ended, at least legally. Dr. Hutchins, now 51, witnessed enslaved people celebrating their freedom in the streets. He saw families searching for separated loved ones, people taking surnames for the first time, children learning to read in schools set up by Northern missionaries. And he wondered about the children in his journal. Did they know now who they really were? Did freedom give them the truth that slavery had denied? He sought some of them out, curious about their fates. Jacob, who bore Colonel Fairmont's features, had survived the war and was working as an independent carpenter in Charleston. He had taken the surname Freeman, a common choice among formerly enslaved people. Dr. Hutchins treated him for pneumonia in 1866 and asked carefully if he knew anything about his parentage. "I know my mother's name was Rachel," Jacob said. "She died when I was young. As for my father," he shrugged, "I've been told things, heard whispers, but I don't know for certain and I'm not sure I want to. Some truths might not make my life better, Doctor." It was a sentiment Dr. Hutchins heard repeatedly. Many of the mixed-race children, now adults, had suspicions or half-knowledge about their parentage, but few actively sought confirmation. What would it gain them? The white families they might be related to would never acknowledge them. There were no inheritances to claim, no legal relationships to establish. The conspiracy of silence had served its purpose so well that even in freedom, many chose to maintain it. Mary, Adelaide Weston's daughter by blood if not by law, had married and moved to Atlanta, escaping Charleston and its complicated history. Samuel, Judge Reynolds' son, had taken work as a porter and showed no interest in confronting his past. Eleanor Marchmont, Ellie, had been freed per her father's earlier instructions and was working as a seamstress. Senator Marchmont had died in 1864, never having acknowledged her. She knew, Dr. Hutchins discovered, about her true parentage. Other people at Riverside Plantation had told her over the years, but she had no interest in claiming any connection to the Marchmont name. "That family gave me nothing but secrets and shame," she told Dr. Hutchins when he encountered her in 1868. "Why would I want to carry their name?" Dr. Hutchins continued his documentation through the post-war years, though with less urgency. His journal recorded how the conspiracy of silence persisted even after the system that had created it collapsed. Former masters saw their unacknowledged children in the streets and looked away. Former slaves encountered their white relatives and chose not to claim connection. The patterns he had first observed in 1847 had become so deeply embedded that they survived the revolution that was supposed to overturn them. Dr. William Hutchins died in Charleston in 1873 at the age of 59 of heart failure. His funeral was modest but respectable. His obituary in the Charleston News and Courier noted his 26 years of medical service to the community and his dedication to scientific observation and documentation. His estate, such as it was, went to a nephew in Boston. Among his effects was a massive journal, over 700 pages, densely filled with observations about Charleston's families, documented resemblances, recorded interviews, and a comprehensive account of how an entire society had conspired to deny visible truth. The nephew, not understanding its significance, placed it in storage with other family papers. The sealed packages Dr. Hutchins had distributed remained where he had placed them, waiting patiently. The one with Miss Thornton's lawyer was delivered to Dr. Hutchins's nephew in 1879, per her instructions. The one sent to the minister in Richmond was destroyed in a fire in 1882. The one buried outside Charleston was never recovered, lost to time and fading memory. But some survived. Dr. Hutchins's journal and the preserved copies would eventually surface in archives, university libraries, historical societies. Decades later, then, a century later, researchers would discover them and marvel at the detailed documentation of Charleston's conspiracy of silence. The children, Dr. Hutchins had observed, Jacob and Mary and Samuel and Eleanor and dozens of others, lived their lives and died, most without ever being publicly acknowledged by their white families. Their descendants scattered across the country, carrying genetic inheritances from families that would never claim them. Charleston itself moved forward, rebuilding after the war, adapting to new realities, maintaining some traditions while abandoning others. The grand houses where Dr. Hutchins had observed the conspiracy of silence became museums, tourist attractions, symbols of a vanished world. But the patterns he documented persisted in quieter forms. Families that knew their complicated genealogies but chose not to speak of them publicly. Resemblances that were noticed but not mentioned. Truths that were known but not acknowledged. The conspiracy of silence, it turned out, was more durable than slavery itself. It was built not on laws or economic systems, but on something deeper. The human capacity for denial, the social power of collective agreement, the choice to not see what was plainly visible. Dr. Hutchins had documented that conspiracy in extraordinary detail. He had preserved the truth for history, even though he couldn't speak it in his own time. His journal stood as testament to what he had witnessed. An entire society, bound together in mutual silence, agreeing to look away from living proof of their own contradictions. The children, who looked exactly like their owners, remained unspoken, their truths buried in paper and memory, waiting for a future that might finally be willing to see what Charleston, in 1847 and for generations after, had chosen to ignore.